HTTP is the request response protocol for the web. The key elements of an HTTP request are the HTTP method, which tells the server the action to be performed, the address of the page, or the URL, and any form parameters which perform the same function as arguments to a method. The key elements of an HTTP response are a status code telling whether the request was successful or not, the content type telling the browser what kind of information to expect so that the browser can render it properly, and the actual content, like HTML, an image, a PDF, sound file, video, and the list goes on. Here's a sample HTTP response. First, it contains some header information. Remember that it's going to include either a success code or an error code. It's also going to include information about the content type, something known as the MIME type. Finally, it's going to contain the content. In this case, the content is HTML code. When the browser sees the opening HTML tag, it goes into HTML rendering mode and displays the page to the user. As we mentioned in a previous slide, when the browser sees an image tag, it sends another request to the server for the image, and that image comes back in a different response with a different MIME type. There are two main kinds of HTTP requests: GET requests and POST requests. An example of a GET request is the user clicking a link to a new page and the browser sending a GET request to the server asking for that specific page. For an example involving a POST request, the user fills out a form and hits the Submit button. The browser then sends a POST request to the server that not only contains the URL, but also contains the data from the form. Now, it turns out that you can send data with a GET request. The main difference between a GET request and a POST request is where the data that you send resides. In a GET request, the data is appended to the URL itself. In other words, the data you send will actually appear in the address bar in your browser. The data comes after the question mark, and the parameters are separated by an AND sign. The potential problems with sending data in a GET request are that, one, servers can limit the number of characters that you can send with a GET request. Two, the data you send in a GET request is exposed, so it's not secure by any means. And three, you cannot bookmark a form submission. Here's a sample GET request. The first line of a request is called the request line. The first word in the request line is the HTTP request method. In this case, the method is GET. Just after the request method, we have the path to the resource on the web server. And because this is a GET request, if there are any parameters from a form, for example, the parameters are appended to the path. The parameters come after a question mark and are separated by an AND symbol. In this example, we have two parameters. The first parameter is named color, and it has the value dark. The second parameter is named taste, and it has the value multi. At the end of the request line, we have the protocol version that the client is using. After the request line, we have multiple lines that collectively make up what we call the request headers. Here, the first line of the request headers specifies the host. That's the server. The user agent is the client application that is sending the request. In this case, it's a Mozilla-based browser on a PowerPC Macintosh. The accept line tells the server which MIME types the client knows how to deal with. The anatomy of a POST request is quite similar to the anatomy of a GET request. Like the GET request, it has a request line, and after the request line comes the request headers. The difference comes in where the parameters go. In a POST request, the parameters are part of what is called the request body, or the payload. They are not appended to the resource path as they are in a GET request. So they don't have the limitations they would if they were part of a GET request. GET and POST are by far the most popular HTTP request methods. And they are the ones you will need to understand if you're going to build web applications. But you should know that they are not the only HTTP request methods. Here are a few other methods with a brief description of what they do. Let's take a look at a sample response from a server. A response has both a header and a body. In the first line of the header, we have the protocol version, the status code, and the text version of the status code, which in this case is OK. There are many status codes, but here are the four most common. 200 signifies that the request is OK. This is the standard response for successful HTTP requests. 403, forbidden, signifies that the request is a legal request, but the server is refusing to respond to it. This can happen, for example, if you try to access a forbidden directory on a website. 404, not found, is probably one we've all seen at one time or another. The page can't be found, though it's possible that it may be available again sometime in the future. And 500, internal server error, is a generic message that is returned when some kind of error occurred, but no other error message seems to make sense. Included in this particular response is a cookie. A cookie is a small piece of data that is stored in your browser so that the website can remember certain information about you. For example, if you log into a website, the server may send the client a cookie with a unique session identifier so that you don't have to log in again for some specified period of time, as long as you're using the same browser. And the last thing that you should notice here is that MIME type, which in this case is text/HTML. That tells the browser to expect HTML code in the body of the response. The MIME type should be one of the types that the browser said it accepts in the HTTP request.